Oh, I think it's going to work this time.
It says live from my side. We're live.
Oh, I think we are live. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Exploring Genuine Transformation. And in this week's episode, Mary McGillivray is going to be interviewing me. And so I'm going to give it over to her and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. Mary McGillivray here. I'm very excited to be interviewing you, Lori, on this topic that is so integral to the heart of your work. And today's topic is why not healing early attachment trauma can keep you on an endless merry-go-round of healing. So, guys, before we completely talk about Lori, I want to tell you how excited I am for this interview because Lori, I've worked with Lori in both a professional capacity as her business mentor, and she's also become a friend over time. And what I've had the good fortune to unfold is the depth and the complexity of the work that she does, but also seeing firsthand some of the incredible results that she helps people get via her customized and dynamic approach to working with people. So, Lori, can we start today by having you tell us about who you are? What's your professional background? What's your story?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Sorry, there's a bee going by. I'm sitting outside. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I have been a licensed psychotherapist for the last 13 years. And I have done training in a wide range of both trauma healing and psychotherapeutic approaches. So I trained initially in my MFT program was in a somatic psychology program. So it was very based in the body and based in, somatics. And then I did other training, like I did very long trainings in relational psychodynamic therapy for women. And I did a 2-year training with children and teenagers and their parents that was psychoanalytic. I've trained in a system called AEDP, some in somatic experiencing. And I've also worked with, low income families and children working in home with trauma. So that was like earlier in my career. And actually, even previous to being in this field, I worked at a group home for girls when I was right out of college. So I've been on a pretty long track of having a passion for women, for specifically working with girls and women, but also with children and adults and parents. So then I lived in the Bay Area for many years, and for about 10 years there, I had a private practice that was about 2/3 working with children, teenagers, and their parents, and the rest was adults. And so I bring that into my work around trauma and around development. I basically have worked with hundreds of kids from different developmental ages. And so I can see that again and again in how adults are presenting themselves and work with that in a very dynamic way, as we'll get into in the interview. I'm trying to think if there's anything else about my professional background. I also have a background in, I have been steeped in different spiritual lineages, but most notably in Theravadan and Tibetan Buddhism since I was probably for about 20, 25 years. And I've had the privilege and the honor of studying and practicing with teachers that are really bringing together attachment theory and trauma and psychology with Buddhism. And so I bring all of this into my work. So I could probably go on and on about this because there's just so many different overlaps. It's really a passion of mine. So that's my professional background. Just to give way to like my personal story, which I've written about at times online, but to share. So
Wait, but one thing before, can I summarize a
yeah,
little before we talk about your
sure.
story? So from a purely selfish perspective, as a business consultant who's worked with, I don't know, hundreds of clients also, one of the things that I enjoy about working with Lori as a client is that not only does she have a really deep practical knowledge from having worked with hundreds of clients, she also has the academic knowledge from having this huge variety, right? You have this huge variety of tools that you've learned and know how to use, but you also have this whole spiritual side of you as well that you're really bringing to the table whenever you work with anyone. And so it's really like the whole package experience in a way. Yeah, and I just wanted to call that out because it's not often, right, Lori, that we get somebody who can really do multiple, who can really touch all areas of the being in that way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so then can you dive in, I guess, into your personal story a little bit and how it relates to our topic?
Yeah, and I appreciate what you just said. Thank you so much for just seeing me in that way. And also just that I love to geek out on all of it. It's sort of like my life's work, right?
Right.
Like beyond my work, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so actually I love what you just said, because I think that, you know, to add to that, I have a very intense and personal story that I've had to work through, which is why I, you know, got into this field in the first place. I mean, it's why I sought out any, you know, Buddhism or becoming a therapist. All of it really comes back to that. So just to give like a brief, there's so much I could say about my personal story. I've overcome a lot in this life. I think the thing that I'd like to share is just, because it relates to early attachment specifically, is that, you know, basically my struggle started when I came into the world, and I was I had this interesting combination as a child of being extremely sensitive and almost psychic, and also extremely fierce. Mm-hmm. So, and, you know, I came into the world, and the world like kind of felt like what I was, and sort of in this weird spiritual, like very bright as well, like in my mind. So it's almost like I saw things before I really was ready to, which happens when kids are pretty bright. And basically it felt like I came into the world felt like it was way too much for me. And I love my family, and I'm just to say I have a great relationship with my family now. And my parents really didn't, there was a couple of things that I really needed as a child that they were not able to give me. One was this kind of mirroring and clear seeing and attunement to my inner world. So that's just not their forte. They're not good at that for their own reasons and their own trauma. And so they couldn't see me. And I was also very fierce and very intense. And because I wasn't getting what I needed, I wasn't the kid that shut down initially. I actually had a lot of tantrums, and I kept kind of fighting. And we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about, you know, early attachment trauma, but my form of it was like, basically what would happen is that I would attempt to get my needs met, but like I wasn't getting them met, then I would like fight for it. And then I would basically shut down. Like I would fight for it. So I was really angry trying to get them to notice me, and they couldn't handle my intensity. So then I would shut down into depression. And then I would try again. And actually that's exactly how the other interesting point about that is that got carved in my nervous system, because we don't come into the world with an intact nervous system. It gets developed in our, you know, in our environment. And so basically that's how my nervous system formed. So it was basically this kind of like, I have all this energy. I was also a kid that had a lot of energy and power. And we'll get into that in this interview, because I work with a lot of high sensitive people, women especially, who then they also have a lot of power, but it gets shut down. And that's a form of attachment trauma as well. That can happen with an attachment relationship that's not, you know, secure. Anyway, and so just to say that then that's how my nervous system got formed. And the two things that I really needed, which was like this clear seeing and mirroring and attunement, and being contained and held, like literally my parents being able to, you know, hold the intensity that was me, they couldn't do for me. And so that created a whole slew of struggles for me. And I mean, my childhood was quite challenging. I remember, like, you know, teenagehood was challenging. And by the time I was 18, I had an eating disorder. I had severe depression, severe like suicidal ideation, never had a plan or anything. I was kind of like a lot of shame. the thing I haven't said about, because we could talk about this all day and I want to end it, but what I haven't said also is there's also a family dynamic that I'm sure many of us have our own version of, where, you know, there was just a lot of guilt and shame that got, you know, especially because I wasn't really seen and met, got overlaid in my experience. So that's something that I had to really work with. And yeah, so then after that, you know, once I got to college, I really went from 18 on, I really got onto this very intense spiritual, emotional, psychological journey, and pretty much committed myself to finding the way through. Because to me, it felt like it was either that or I was gonna kill like I was gonna die. Like there was no option. So I think that that's the most relevant to say in the course of this interview. I mean, I will say that the only thing that I'll add is that, and this is part of my personal story that I've written about other places, is that, you know, healing and personal growth and self-development and spirituality, to some extent over time, even though I had a love for them, became an addiction. And they're an addiction that actually, it's a good, like to some extent it was a good addiction because it helped me through. But it also led to this experience of constantly feeling like I was never there, like I could never be happy, I could never just be okay. So that was another thing that I had to really work through. And it's also something that, you know, I'm very passionate about helping my clients with, because I see that that happens when there is, you know, it happens for a couple of reasons, but one, when we aren't getting the right help. I mean, I got a lot of different help, but I never really, like what I've created over time professionally really came out of all the trials and tribulations that I went through. I always joke around that I took the long road on every single subject, on every single, like I went into, you know, so that I could offer people the shorter road. And I actually think I do effectively do that.
Well, so but before we talk about the healing, I would actually like us almost to take a step back, because you started talking about this when you were talking about your childhood, the lived experience of it. But can you explain to us from your perspective as a professional, what does it actually mean to have early attachment trauma? What is that?
Yeah. So, you know, I loved in kind of, whoa, can you hear this really loud sound? No? Okay. I'm in the jungle. So I was really thinking about this before the interview, because, you know, we can look at early attachment trauma in a variety of ways. I mean, I think first and foremost, what I would say is that, you know, we can look at it through an attachment theory lens, like, did you have a secure attachment, or did you have an anxious or avoidant attachment? And, you know, we could get into the ins and outs of, or a disorganized attachment, which usually comes from a lot more trauma in the system. And we could get into the ways, you know, how those are created. There's not only a lot of research on it, but there's obviously there's specific kinds of parent-child dynamics that takes place in. And then, you know, so I'm just going to, maybe we'll get into it, but I'll put it, there's a lot to say on this subject. We're not going to get to everything today, just FYI. I'm just saying that to our audience. And then I think, you know, kind of overall, it's like, were you in an environment where there was abuse, neglect, where your feelings, your needs weren't seen, were minimized, or where there was inconsistency, that a parent was there some of the time, but they weren't there the other time. Obviously that's, and also within the inconsistency, like they were maybe there for, maybe it was only based on their own needs and not based on your needs. That's actually more obviously ambivalent attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment. And in a more avoidant attachment, like when someone would develop that, it'd be like the parent could be abusive or shaming or overbearing. There wasn't any space for a child to have their feelings. So the other thing I want to name about this that I've also said a lot is that it also, and obviously the extreme of this is like having a narcissistic parent, a parent who's borderline, a parent who there's a lot of gaslighting and manipulation and actual physical and sexual abuse. So, I mean, that's the extreme, But what I'm actually in, and I work with those people too, and I love working with those people. And I also work with people who, have been in narcissistic abusive relationships. I really get the dynamics in that, but even as adults. But what I'm actually really interested in, and I would say a lot of my clients who come to me experienced, was a more subtle form. It's not exactly subtle, but I'm going to say it this way. It's like a more subtle form of neglect, which is when you're highly sensitive and you're not seen, or your feelings aren't mirrored and attuned. It's actually a form of neglect. And it's, you feel like, I'm alone in this world and I have to tend to my own experience, and you're not seeing it reflected back. And then it also becomes extremely difficult in adulthood. I mean, as you grow, to know who you are, what you feel, right? Like, part of this interview is about how do you reclaim sovereignty and freedom and who you truly are. So there can be a lot of confusion. I experienced that. That was part of my story. It took me years to, there was a subtle, even though I had a lot of emotion, there was a lot of dissociation. I remember sitting 6-week long silent meditation retreats when I started sitting retreats, and literally, like, one of the first ones, it was like, it was literally like reconnecting to, like, I don't know what I'm feeling. What am I feeling? And actually, making contact with that. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of far reaching effects for that kind of, like, neglect of not being mirrored and seen, because, also you then take on, as women, we take on conditioning anyway, right? Obviously we're conditioned in certain ways, but then you take on even more conditioning. I'll just share because it's coming up, part of my personal story was that I literally remember at, like, age 6, basically being like, I feel so different and alone. And essentially looking out and saying, everybody in my world seems happy, so I'm just going to pretend to be happy. Like, it was a moment, literally, that I was.
Well, so, and is this, for example, I'm just reflecting back here, is that type of experience, what I'm curious actually too, is about how would our viewers know, potentially, unless, of course they've already looked at it in a therapeutic setting or in a personal growth setting, how would they know if they may be experiencing the effects of something like this?
Well, I'm sort of tempted, before answering your question, to say a little bit more about, because I have more to say about what other forms of attachment trauma.
Okay.
And then we can maybe I can answer that.
Yeah, sure. So what are the forms? Can we create some?
Right. Well, I think I said a couple, when there's severe abuse, or there's minimization, and then there's, like, this kind of form of neglect with high sensitivity. The other one that I wanted to say, which I actually think it's because since I've worked with parents and kids a lot, I've seen this. Sometimes there's just not a good match between parent and child. So obviously there's the extreme form of, like, we can see how our parents did their best, but there's extreme forms of trauma that parents have experienced, or narcissism, or borderline, whatever, these extreme things that are often more obvious to people. But I think also, like, for example, if you're like in my case, if you're a very sensitive child, but then your parents miss you. My parents were very well-meaning. And I see this all the time. I saw this all the time working with children. Like, the parents would work with me and they actually wanted what was best for their kids, and they just could not, there was some level of health, but they just could not understand their kid. And that, with my help, they were able to shift it because they had enough health to take in the feedback. But I wanted to give just even one example of that, like, and the other thing I wanted to say is, in that bad match, kids always internalize things. So sometimes kids have internalized, like, I've worked with kids a lot who they literally can't take in that their parent is there. So like, I literally will have the parent be like, have them like, okay, we're having special time together, and then ask them, like, what was it like that we spent this time together? Because we're trying to build in their system that there's actually, the parent is actually there, that they're not alone. So I don't know. I just want to see if there's anything else. I think that kind of covers. I just want to make early attachment trauma. The reason that I say that is because I want to make it I think it's important to make it a broader, it feels broader to me than just these very extreme situations that we often talk about. just because people will have, and then we can go to your question, people will have symptoms and be like, I work with people all the time who are like, oh, my parents were great, you know, and it's like, okay, but you're, you know, you don't feel like it's okay to have these feelings. Like, you don't feel like it's okay to, you know, go after what you want. You're still in a codependent relationship with your mom, like, you know, those kinds of things, right? It's like, there's something else going on here. So,
yeah. And so here's a question as well, more for our viewers is, can you explain a little bit also about the attachment theory lens? Because probably a lot of our viewers have heard about this in some sense. So can you give a brief explanation of kind of what that is and how you have potentially seen that develop maybe in parent-child dynamics or in your adult clients?
I mean, I think I would do it briefly only because I actually think it's only like a small, it's an element, but it's not, in my opinion, like the main way through the healing process. Interestingly, I don't know. That's just what comes to mind. But I mean, what I
Why
could
not?
say. Let me think about that. Well, first of all, I think that so I could briefly explain each of them, and I sort of did. I explained what, you know, ambivalent attachment is like the parents inconsistent. They're meeting your needs based on what, you know, mostly based on when they're available and what they need. And so that creates an environment of, and actually this is relevant of what we see in adulthood. It creates an environment of what I call the hungry ghost syndrome, where you're kind of like love is always right around the corner, but you can't quite get there. So we can look at that in terms of addiction. We can look at that in terms of having an unrealistic expectations and assessments of your actual gifts and your actual abilities. And just to give an example, because I did a course last year that was serving women in the coaching industry with this, because what can happen is that it's like, oh, and the coaching industry mimics this as well in its own way. But we'll stick to this topic right now. But basically, you know, that there's this experience of like not knowing how to take realistic steps. Right, like, I think it's very common for people who have this kind of patterning to be like, you know, oh, I should just be able to create this. Look, I'm watching this person. They created this business out of scratch, like out of nowhere. I should be able to do it too. What's wrong with me? Because you didn't get like sort of proper training, and even in the nervous system in the body of like, okay, like, meaning that, how do I say this? Like when love is so out of reach, or your needs being met, where your needs were never met, or they were inconsistently met, you create fantasies around how you think life is, and life is not actually that way, right? Because you never actually learned like, oh, this is the steps of life, or, you know, oh, this is what happens when I reach towards my parent. They respond to me. They're responsive, you know, they help me meet my needs, right? You actually don't know how to do that. And so another like symptom would be like, you know, someone might not only be unrealistic, but they might not know how to ask for help, right? Or they might go and ask for help in the wrong places. Or children, right? And so then we do this as adults, internalize like, well, it must be me. I must be doing something wrong. You know, I hear this all the time. I'm teaching a course on money, and like a lot of the women right now, it's like they're watching people online, and it's like, you know, why aren't people responding to, you know, this beautiful thing that I created? Or, you know, I like maybe not feeling like they're good enough, when it's like, yeah, because Facebook isn't even showing your post. Or, I mean, right, like that's a stupid example, but it's like going back to basics, like, you know, that we don't, there's a sense of like, I must be doing something wrong because I never can get this, but also because I don't actually know the realistic steps.
And so that's ambivalent attachment.
Sorry, I have so much to say on each subject, so I say a lot, but you can keep interrupting.
Well, but what are some of my thing is more, I want to make sure our audience hears about the depth, but also gets a fundamental understanding of what we're talking about here. Because it's actually a really complex subject, you know, and you know so much.
Complex subject. And actually, I really want to make sure we get to like how I work with people around it, because I think that's the more complex subject, actually. I think there's I think this is why my big passion is like, I don't think people are always getting the right kind of help. And I'm obviously not the only one to do it, but I think that there is like, this impacts every single area of your life. And so I think that if you don't get the help with these kind of early attachment patterns, the trauma, everything that you've internalized, and not only that you get the help, we'll go into this at the end, but I'll just say this briefly, or as the interview goes on, but not only that you get the help, like with the understanding it, but that you get the help through the body, through the nervous system, through working with the trauma and the activation pattern in the body.
Absolutely.
And having the right relational holding from the therapist, which is very specific. And I'm not only therapist, it could be coach or mentor. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, if we go back to like just briefly avoidance, I mean, basically avoidant attachment is often, like I said, there's.
So wait, here's a question. Can you first tell us all the different frames? Ambivalent, avoidant.
Sure, I know, I go. So ambivalent, there's anxious ambivalent, which is like your needs are inconsistently, chronically unmet. Met sometimes, not met sometimes. That also can be if you had like a borderline parent, that's usually the environment. But borderline can also go into disorganized attachment, which is I'll just say what it is since I'm touching upon it. Disorganized attachment is usually when the parent is both fears the child and is invokes fear in the child. So like an example that I actually think is really great, a colleague told me this once about her childhood. It's like she asked her mom to make her a sandwich. Her mom starts making the sandwich and then basically goes into a dissociative response and then yells at her for like, so it's like the child's like, what, like, it's completely confused, right? Like there's a confusion in the environment and a fear. And also that disorganized can come from like lots of abuse and trauma, and even things like, you know, oh, somebody hurt somebody, but we're ignoring it. We're not talking about it. And I want to also say that I think a lot of codependency can come from, if we go back to anxious ambivalent attachment, because there's kind of a, like, I have to take care of my parent because they're kind of not okay. I mean, that could be in kind of both of those forms. And then there's avoidant attachment is usually when a parent is more, the parent is more, I want to say like, either very harsh, shaming, or kind of overbearing, and there's no space for like the child's needs. And so the child learns to go away and to not depend on anybody. A very interesting, I'm just going to add this because I think it's sort of interesting, is that when they did studies, there's a study that's called the Strange Situation that they did that tested early attachment patterns for toddlers and their parents. And when the anxious ambivalent parent left, the child would be inconsolable, and they'd still be inconsolable when the parent came back. When the avoidant parent left, the avoidant toddler basically acted like they didn't care. And when the parent came back, they ignored them. And when they measured their cortisol levels, they were the exact same. So avoidant people actually, in their avoidance, there's still a lot of stress on the system. And I'm trying to think about kind of like, you know, and then there's secure attachment, obviously, which is not really what we're talking about here, but I could also describe it. But what I want to say is, I'm trying to think about what avoidant, you know, how to describe to people kind of the impacts of having an avoidant attachment system. Because I actually think sometimes people will toggle between anxious and avoidance. Sometimes they're like part of the same, where it's like, oh, I want your help, but now I can't really take it in. I don't trust it. So avoidance, like they often say with avoidance that, like in the literature, that it's like, they're not aware. Sometimes avoidant people aren't aware of wanting intimacy. They're not aware of wanting the connection. But part of working with someone who's avoidant is about moving really slow and making it on their terms so as not to overwhelm the system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but I think of, you know, we could say some of the impacts in adulthood are not being able to have you know, not being able to have intimacy, struggling with intimacy.
So are these, wait, so when we talk about impacts, are you talking about impacts? Can we talk about just impacts of uh, attachment trauma in general? So if for our viewers, what are some things that might come up for them or common things that you see for people that might be a sign, hey, I might need to work through some attachment, challenges?
Sure, sure. So one of the main things that I see actually is that this kind of conflict between one's, what I would call one's aliveness and power and vital and authenticity. It's like a kind of true self and a kind of shutdown, or like literally a shutdown in the system. Like, I don't even want to try. That could be one response.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to be good at this. I keep working at it and nothing ever changes. That's a common, specifically when you kept trying to get love and you didn't get it. And also like security or safety, right? Because as children, we basically are so smart. I love to say this. Like, this is one of the ways that I work with this as well, is that we actually created the perfect protective mechanisms to keep us safe. But part of the problem is that they aren't working for us in adulthood. So, they're actually creating problems now. And so part of the work that I do is actually giving those space and loving them and bringing compassion to them and being with them exactly as they are. But so one of the things that I've seen this a lot, and I see this a lot in women. I think it's a particular conditioning for women also, because there's so many mixed messages about what it means to be a woman. And are you supposed to, this is how you're powerful, or, but don't be too powerful, be intelligent, but not too intelligent, all these kinds of things that happen. But I think that so it can be a conflict between, aliveness, power, here's me in my fullness and my vitality and my authentic self, and like safety and security, or shut down. I think obviously there's different, every human has this. So this isn't only about early attachment trauma, but because it's just the common struggle. But I think when we see it in extremes and we keep playing it out, is any emotion that we have that we didn't feel like was acceptable as children, we're going to shut it down, right? So if we feel like, I work with people who, for example, have codependency, or right, because like maybe with a partner where they feel like if I don't take care of you and if I listen to my own needs, then I'm not going to have what I need. I'm not going to be okay. So that's one thing. Let me see. I mean, I think what I said is, I really think what I see across the board, there's a couple pieces to this, because I think it can go two ways. But one thing that I see across the board is what I said earlier, which is that in this kind of hungry ghost syndrome, what one might see is that I have all these talents. I'm so gifted. Like I have all these creative ideas, right? Like I know what I want to do in life, but I can't ever seem to create what I want. And I'm hard on myself, and I actually feel my nervous system gets dysregulated when I try things and then I don't feel like they're received in the way that I want them to. Or my nervous system, it's kind of like almost like you get stopped in your tracks, right? Like I can't actually so it's beyond like being able to kind of overcome and say, okay, I'm feeling this and I'm going to keep going. It's like, I'm feeling this and I'm actually completely overwhelmed. Or for someone who's avoidant, it might be like, I'm feeling this, but I'm just like, I'm never doing what I want in life, because basically it's too much. Like I can't even open up the system, because basically I'm going to feel overwhelmed in my body and in my mind, which is common, because when we have trauma and it's locked in the body, the result is that we have a lot of thinking. So when we work with the body and the trauma in the nervous system, we work with the trauma in the nervous system in the body and in the relationship, then, the mind starts to calm. So that's one thing that I've seen, is that, and I love working with people who are struggling with this, and I often do. The other thing is, I think people who are actually quite successful, let's say in their career, they're doing really well. Maybe they're working in like corporate, or they're working in their world. Maybe they have their own business as well, but then they experience a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of kind of like on their own. Like they have a struggle to actually, share that with others. They seem on the surface like, oh, I'm doing really great, but they're actually quite miserable. Because obviously you can be like uber successful in life, but if you're not happy or you're not enjoying it, then it doesn't, right? That's like another form of, I would say that's another, just, I mean, you'll be very miserable, right? Trying to think if there's,
Well, and so one of the things that I'm picking up on that's interesting is that there are many different ways in which this attachment trauma could come up from childhood, and it could be extreme or it could be not extreme. That's one of the things you've brought up several times. But also, even the effects in adulthood, or the way that people see it, is it could be very extreme or it could be less extreme. And it can be seen in many areas of life, whether it's relationships, your relationship with your own family, intimate relationships, career, day-to-day life, as you said, even showing up on things like the way we respond to social media, for example.
Yeah.
And so then
and I would even add like how we care for ourselves, right? Like our self-care, like, what our hobbies, like the ability, obviously, I mean, I'll just add this because we didn't speak to it, and I didn't speak to relationships either, but when you're in a secure attachment relationship and you feel secure of yourself, you actually then feel secure to explore the world and to explore, all these new, exciting, creative things, right? That happens in childhood first by like exploring the world around you. It happens in adulthood by like, it's like, I'm in this career and, oh, now I want to expand it because I'm interested in this and that. And so that's a huge impact, right? Because if you're preoccupied with like your trauma, your emotional world, your inner world, or relationship, which is the other thing that can happen, or why you're not measuring up, if you're preoccupied with that, then there's no space to actually, explore the world. So it mirrors that exact childhood patterning. Yeah, go on.
Absolutely. Well, no, I mean, I think that's very important as well. And perhaps for our viewers, that this might cause some reflection for them around, is this something that's showing up in their lives, right? I mean, from a personal perspective, it's definitely something I've done a lot of work on too. And so here's a question then: can you share with us about the way that you have developed to work with individuals around this? I would say maybe specifically more from the adult frame, since that's most of our viewers. But I'm just very curious because you mentioned it a few times. So what is that actually like? How does it work?
Yeah. I would love to share about that. That's my big passion. Well, it's interesting. Just before I say this, I think I use a lot of different approaches, and I'll kind of get into it. I think what I found over time, first of all, I think I actually developed what I do simply by, I mean, it also relates to all the training and the experience I have and the training that I have, because I've trained in a lot of things, but literally by experience. Like it's literally because I had so much background in training and experience and theory that then I just was working with people and I just found a way that kind of really, really works. And so so that's been interesting for me to track, because I've been thinking lately, like, how could I teach this to others? Because I do think it's a kind of unique approach. And so what the approach is let's see. So I work on a lot of different levels. What I guess the way I'm going to try to like explain this so that it kind of expands out, because again, I'm still kind of in the process of learning how to explain it. But you could spend 10 minutes with me doing it. Maybe I'll do that online at some point, and then you would see exactly what I'm doing. It's kind of a funny thing. So usually what I do, I mean, I hear what the person is going through, and we can start anywhere, like any moment in time now, any situation. And then I basically start with like, what's happening in your body? Where are you feeling that, right? And then depending on the person's ability to be with what is present in their body. You know, I have them go into the body, feel the sensation, drop out of the mind, even though it came from, you know, a story or an experience. And then what I do is I start to track, I'm tracking the unfolding process that's happening in the body. Sometimes it leads to emotion. Sometimes it leads to more thinking in the mind or more nervous system activation, which can, the reason I say thinking in the mind, because often people start then giving me more story about what's happening because it's hard to be in the body. Other forms of activation can be like, they literally are starting to like get overwhelmed, and I can kind of see that. So this is kind of what I'm talking about now is like the heart of trauma theory. And I would even say like somatic experiencing. And so if activation starts to come up, I then do things to help them to regulate and ground, some of which, you know, can be like finding a place in the body that feels regulating, looking at me, you know, looking at something beautiful, and then still staying with that sensation. So then once we get beneath the activation, and the activation can look like shutdown, the person could totally kind of zone out, right? But we're trying to get them into a window of tolerance so that we can begin, because basically beneath the activation are the feelings that weren't felt. And that's what we're trying to do. So then we get to the feelings that weren't felt. I'm saying this, I mean, this is a dynamic process, but I'm just trying to kind of give a sense of it. And then people experience, you know, then they start to feel that. And then sometimes it can lead, it's just very natural, for me at least, where it leads. Sometimes I see their attachment pattern exactly. Like I can literally name to somebody because I've studied this for so long. Like, so I don't know your childhood enough, but I'm thinking that, you know, this seems like this is what happened. And they're like, yep, that's exactly what happened. And then we can work with like, we can work with the early attachment pattern. Sometimes it involves them being, me and them being together with the sensation coming up or with the emotion coming up, what it reminds them of, what it takes them back into. So there's some inner child work. I don't relate to inner child work because I don't do it as work. It feels like it's more of like, it's basically that we're doing the reparenting together. So I'm helping them reparent that part, but I'm also reparenting with them. And then the other thing that I would say that and then there's two other pieces I kind of want to name. So that's one process. Another thing that I do that I haven't seen, I know other people do it, but I haven't seen it in some of the leading trauma theories as much, as I do a lot of interrupting, because I believe that like sometimes we don't just need somebody to like be with us in this gentle way. Sometimes we literally needed that parent that was like, I'm not going to let you talk to yourself that way. Like, I hear that you're really upset right now, but I'm not going to let you tell yourself that you're an idiot. We all needed that as kids. That's partly why we developed shame. Like, we needed a parent to come in strongly. So sometimes people need that in their nervous system. Like, they need somebody to be like, okay, I need you to put your feet on the ground. I need you to look at me. Like that level of wrath. I would call that wrath. I would call that a parent basically protecting the child, holding them. I've worked with a lot of out of control kids. So this is what it kind of reminds me of. It's like the out of control parts of ourself. So that's something that I really feel strongly about, and I see being super effective in the work that I do as well. And then the other piece that I think, you know, most coaches are not trained in, some have the capacity, but therapists are more trained this way, is the relational part, which is that, you know, for example, this is a minor one, but like I was working with somebody recently, and as we started to go into their experience, she felt like she didn't know me that well. And she was like, I don't trust you. And I don't like, her body literally would not, she was like, I don't know if you're actually gonna like be here for me. Right. And it was in her body. So not only am I with her in her body, which is where I think some practitioners go wrong, because we're having a relational moment. She's re-experiencing something that she's experienced in her childhood or with other people in her life. So then I work with it relationally. It's like, okay, now her and I are in that. It's like, okay, so you don't trust me. Let's be with that together, right? And let's like check in with yourself. What is it that you actually need right now? You know, do you need something from me, for example? Do we need to just sit with that part of you that's, you know what, I'm protecting myself? because a lot of what also happened in our childhood, and this relates to the trauma piece, and people who work with trauma also work with this, is that nobody was there to protect us, right? And that was a mechanism that actually needed to be there. And so we don't want to just be like, move past that, like, let's do violence and like push past that and, you know, be with me. We actually want to, like, this is the opportunity to rework it. So I think I think that gives probably the best I've ever been able to explain this. I know it's pretty in depth for the people watching, but I think I'm trying to give you kind of a view of, you know, I feel like I play both a reparenting role in a lot of different ways because I understand that. I also can feel what age people are at, like just because I've worked with people a lot. But also I think part of parenting is like doing the coaching work or the mentorship work, which whatever we want to call it. Like as parents, we're encouraging of our children, right? Like, wow, you want to like. So I work with a lot of people who like maybe they're feeling like they're stalled in business, or they can't touch their, you know, they're like they aren't like their relationship isn't going well. So I'm coaching them also on like kind of helping them think through what's going to work for them, coaching them on communication, on boundaries. Those are two of my
well, so one thing interesting that's I want to call out is that it sounds like in the process, the unfolding process of working with you, you know, which happens over time, it's not only is the individual met where they're at by you, you know, as is appropriate for the individual. But they also actually, not only do they get the reparenting, which might be encouragement, which might be boundaries, which as you might be interrupted, right? But also they actually learn the tools to be with themselves. And then, as you said, this can unfold into a variety of other tools for better living, as you said, communication, boundaries, etc.
Yeah, that was the next, thank you for saying that. That was the next thing I was going to say. I obviously have so much passion and I love this topic, but is that I was going to say that what I really see, and Chelsea and I talked about this a lot in our interview. We had a great interview that was related to this, Chelsea Adair and I, but just that a lot of times what I think can be missing in some healing approaches, or it's more prevalent with therapy than like in the coaching world, but what's missing in the coaching world is, you know, that we internalize, like we sure, we're ultimately empowering our clients to be able to think things through themselves. And I mean, this is an important piece for people who have early attachment trauma as well. I don't want to give the impression that I'm like, you know, that I'm like basically saying like I have all the answers. I'm actually, a huge part of my work is actually supporting the women that I work with, the people that I work with, to empower themselves to what I consider to be sovereignty, which is like, what's your way? Like if I'm doing something with you and it's not working, then let's talk about that and let's find the way together. That's one of the gifts of working with me, is I have so many skills and tool sets. So if somebody comes to me with something, I start working with them in the way that I just said, and then they're like, you know what, right now I actually just need you to blah blah blah, or I need this, then that's part of the parenting, is actually like, here, I'm here for you. I'm not going to be reactive like your parent was, you know, like I'm not going to have this response. I'm actually going to figure out with you. And if something isn't working for you, I'm also going to be there to hold space for that and for us to explore it together. So I don't want to give the impression, even though I think it's I'm doing a both and part of the reparenting that I see that I'm doing is that I'm providing it with who I am and how I show up. I'm also we're doing it together. I'm also saying, what's it like for you to be with that part of you, not just me being with that part of them, which some therapy approaches like psychoanalysis do a lot of. There's like an overemphasis on the need for the practitioner. So I don't think that anybody who works with me would say that I do that at all, but it's like I feel like it's kind of the best of all worlds, because it's like I can be that, right? But I'm also always, what does this person need? This is not about my way. This is about their way. This is what happens in early attachment trauma. Kids actually, they feel like I have to do it my parents' way in order to be loved, in order to be safe, in order to be secure. So that's one piece. The other piece that Chelsea and I talked about is that we internalize the person that we're working with. Like we, as kids, we internalized what our parents shared with us. So we don't like, sure, we can all, I want to also say this because I have done a ton of inner child work on my own. I've done a ton of like the inner feminine, inner masculine work. I love that work. I don't particularly think that it's an all comprehensive thing. I think for certain kinds of attachment trauma, that is actually just going to be retriggering on its own, because the point is that the person didn't have what they needed in the first place. And so it's like, go do this work alone. No, that doesn't really make sense to me. So that's how I would answer that. Mm-hmm.
So when we think about, so one thing I'm picking up too is I guess what I'm curious about is in your perspective, why is it so critical to heal early attachment trauma to live, as you said, a sovereign life? I know, because we're getting to the end of our interview here we have 10 minutes, and I really want to hear actually your thoughts on this topic, because you've helped so many people through this process.
Yeah.
So what is that actually like? What can that look like for somebody to really work through these things and also learn how to be with themselves in the process?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. I just noticed how much energy I have because I just like have so much energy on this topic. Well, before I answer that, one thing I want to say, I think it's relevant, is I have a lot of people come to me who've actually done a shit ton of work on themselves. They've worked with so many different practitioners, and they still don't feel like they've been able to really shift some of the core patterns. And that actually is very disheartening. So I want to say that I do think on the one hand, it does take time, and we all have our own journey. Like, that is true. But I also think that often people are not getting help in this kind of nervous system. They're getting help either going through the story again and again, like they know their story really, really well. But they're not getting help with kind of repatterning that in the nervous system, and also repatterning their, what I want to say is like, for example, working through the like aliveness, like there's people who, a lot of people come to me with the aliveness power thing. And then we have to work through like that, how that actually occurs in the body. Okay, every time you feel this aliveness, you shut down, right? Or you then get scared. And we keep toggling, and over time, we work that out in the nervous system and the body. So I just think that that's one of your question is about what do you actually get? But I want to say that I think that we aren't able to get sovereignty if we're only using our minds. I think we're not, or we're only in the story. I love quantum healing and things that people are doing, but I'm also just going to call it out to say that when people have early attachment trauma, to then like do some multidimensional healing of trauma and it be completely gone. I've never seen that to be the case. I have people come to me after they've actually tried that kind of thing. And with narcissistic abuse, I've actually also had people come to me and be like, I was just trying to, work it through that way. And it's like, I would not recommend that. But I think here's the thing. I think that the reason that I love this work so much, and specifically around sovereignty, is that, of course, like the encouragement to be who you are, right? The work that I just described, like I'm helping somebody through reparenting in all these different kinds of ways, and reparenting themselves, to be able to really claim, this is what I want. This is who I am. So sometimes we have to go through that process first. Like, that's how I assess people, right? Like, that's how when I first start either a therapy or a mentorship client, I'm like, what is it that you want? Sometimes as they heal, they're like, oh, I didn't want that at all. I actually want this other thing, right? So we keep kind of working it. So there is something about knowing what you want over time, and that then we want to move towards that as a goal, and we want to do that in a realistic way, which is what I do with my clients. But there's also something that I think we can, this approach that I'm talking about, especially working through the body and the nervous system, is we gain freedom and sovereignty in the pattern in the body. And that's what the power of it is. It's like we shift our neural pathways. Another way that we do that, I just want to name that I haven't said, is that in my more intensive programs, I offer scaffolding, what I call scaffolding in between. So I'm doing this with you, but then we're also doing it. I'm also giving you, so I know so many different tools that we figure out the best tools for you as we go along. And then you're practicing them as things happen, when the rubber meets the road, in the moment, when this thing happened in my life, when when I felt overwhelmed. And then I'm available to you, to basically help you through that in between. Because what I found is that the more support that people get, especially in the early stages of that, the nervous system then starts to rewire on its own. And then you have freedom. I mean, that's all I can say. It's like there's freedom and you have freedom from the mind, because I can tell you this, I learned how to parent myself in my mind. It was a maladaptive attempt at parenting because I didn't have the kind of parenting that I needed. So that's one thing. So then I never could enjoy life. So that's another freedom. Like, okay, great. We get to enjoy life now. But also, we're in our bodies more. Our nervous systems are more regulated. We're in our bodies more. When we're in our bodies more and our nervous systems are more regulated, then our thoughts become clearer. We think, more creatively. There's space for us to be creative, right? Like what I said before about being that exploratory child. I feel like as an adult in the last several years, I've gotten to reclaim that. And that's why I've been shifting my work. It's like, wow, this is what I'm passionate about, or I want to learn guitar now, or right? But I'm not preoccupied in the same way by the trauma and my nervous system dysregulation that's constantly coming up. So in my opinion, those things are huge, even more than getting what you want, even more than now I have this perfect relationship, or now I have this career that is, we do get those. I think we can get those things over time, but I think just the sovereignty of I feel good when I wake up. I'm excited to be alive, I'm excited to meet new people today. I'm excited to try this new thing. And then also what I've seen is that people see what's realistic for themselves. You and I talked about this in our interview and I keep repeating it, but that kind of okay, for example, in working with you for my business, it's we have a realistic assessment of my business, right? You and I talk about what is going to work well, what's not, what do I love, what am I passionate about. I actually think you do it business wise, even though you don't realize it. You're kind of like my version, but business wise. I mean, not the trauma stuff, but I think just the encouragement of, right, who do you want to be? What lights you up? Okay, try that. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, right. And then it's and somebody might come to me if then they try things and then they keep getting deflated, right? Because they can't actually keep kind of it's hard for them. But I think that we then are more realistic and then we make choices that are better for ourselves, and then we actually have better results. And then our self-esteem gets better. Then our self-confidence gets better. We feel better. I mean, I could go on about the effects. I think it's huge. And I think it's also really important I'm not saying don't dream big, but in this kind of early attachment trauma, it's so important to be realistic. And it's so important to have people, I find in the course that I'm teaching right now, it's there's a lot of false beliefs people have because of what the coaching industry does there's a lot of beliefs that are actually kind of they don't serve a person. And it's I then come in and say, that's not how you have to do it if that doesn't light you up, right? And then people are oh, good, there's another way to do it. Let's figure out what that is. So I think this all relates to early attachment, right? We're probably at the end, because then it's you have more freedom to basically be oh, I'm just going to let that go. I don't need that. That doesn't work for me. Okay, moving on, right? I mean, there's so many benefits. It really depends on what the person's working with, but.
And so since we are wrapping up, I mean, it seems like the core benefits of working through this is not only they shift how it's possible to shift the actual physical makeup, you said shift neural pathways, but also freedom from these patterns that have been keeping us stuck maybe sometimes for years.
Yeah.
But also the ability to relate to oneself differently and then relate to the world differently, which can result in just a greater feeling of contentment, of excitement, of also being able to handle adversity differently when it does come and being realistic about it.
Yeah.
And I do want to wrap this up here so we can make sure we can actually talk about how to work with you, right?
Yeah.
Because this is incredible. But it sounds like, I mean, it's one of these great gifts of doing the work at such depth and at such both deep and broad,
Yeah.
is truly the benefits of doing this work, especially with you, are that they're so individual to everyone based on where that person
Yeah.
begins and the journey and what they actually need. And so the arc of their life can change drastically over time, but it's very tailored to who they are, right? And then ultimately who they are.
Yeah.
And so, Lori, can you tell us how people could
Yeah.
work with you if they're interested? How do they get in touch?
Well, thank you so much for that summary. I just want to say that was a really beautiful summary of, I think, how I do work with people and why. I just want to say one quick thing. I find that wherever we start in the body, everything gets healed actually in that process, which is awesome. You could be working with money and your stuff around business, your stuff around relationship gets healed. So that's the power of this work. So basically, this is my show. So for those of you on Mary's channel might not know me, but you can follow me here on Facebook under Lori Beth. And you can follow me on Instagram, which is Psycho Spiritual Mentor. And you can, check out more in depth my work with women. My website is Psycho Spiritual Mentorship. And I also am happy to work with men one-on-one. So I offer a highly dynamic and customized approach to individuals who have experienced me. So basically, we would work together to figure out kind of the right way for you. I also do offer groups and classes. Most of those are for women, but I've worked with tons of men. I love working with men. So I think that's all I would say. I don't know. Are there any other channels to reach me?
And so if somebody watches this and they say, Lori, I'm so excited, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
I would say, write me on Messenger. Write me on Messenger. That's probably the easiest way for now, or on Instagram. And then I'll, guide you to the next kind of step in us working together, setting up a meeting to work together and the application process for working with me. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Lori. This was beautiful.
That was really fun. It's my first time. Well, no, it's not my first time being interviewed, but on this show it is. So thank you so much, everyone. And also, if you just have questions and you want to kind of engage more, learn more about this topic, please reach out to me. I'm very on fire about it. Are we out of time?
We are.
Okay. All right. Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, Mary.